Title: The 1.4 billion luxury needle whipping through the sky. China's slenderness crisis roll. Hyperlapse of a thunderstorm rolling over a glowing neon-drenched megacity skyline. The camera rapidly zooms into an impossibly thin, hyper-luxury glass monolith cutting through the low-hanging clouds. Text on screen flashes, 1,100,000, failing piece of art. Urgent, authoritative, high-energy U.S. cable news cadence. Imagine paying millions of dollars for an ultra-luxury penthouse in the clouds, only to watch your premium marble walls crack open while your living room sways 5 feet in the wind. Right now, a cluster of residential megastructures worth over $1.4 billion are literally whipping through the sky above one of China's most elite financial zones. And the most terrifying part? The cutting-edge engineering meant to stabilize them is actually triggering their operational destruction. This is the harrowing reality of a new breed of architectural luxury that has pushed structural physics past the breaking point. Before we unpack this architectural nightmare, if you are new to the channel, we break down the engineering failures, financial disasters, and design cover-ups behind the world's most troubled mega-projects. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss an investigation. Shot. Graphic. Flashback to 2005. The land grab our story begins in 2005. The sprawling metropolis of Shenzhen was undergoing an unprecedented vertical explosion. Along a highly coveted stretch of waterfront real estate facing the bay, previously dominated by low-rise industrial warehouses and second-tier commercial blocks, land was suddenly being re-evaluated. It wasn't yet the playground of billionaire tech magnates, but a visionary developer named Zhang Wei, head of the prominent Huaxin real estate group, quietly acquired a massive, low-slung commercial parking, depot, and transit lot. What Zhang and his institutional backers planned to construct on this tightly constrained site wasn't just another high-rise. It was an absolute defiance of traditional civil engineering. They intended to redefine the very geometry of the residential skyscraper. Archival footage. Press conference with sleek 3D architectural renderings. The camera tracks up a smooth, infinitely tall square column. The project attracted massive institutional funding and national media hype. This was not a standard bulky residential tower. The architect selected for the project was a globally renowned master designer known for extreme structural ambition. The blueprint was stark, brutalist, and mathematically hyper-precise, a pure, square column of high-strength concrete and specialized glass measuring barely 28 meters wide at its base, but rocketing an astronomical 425 meters straight into the atmosphere. To put that scale into perspective, that is roughly the height of a massive commercial supertall, but packed into a footprint smaller than a standard basketball court's length. At that extreme height-to-width ratio, the tower's slenderness ratio clocked in at an unprecedented 115. For context, standard residential high-rises throughout Asia are engineered with a conservative structural ratio of closer to 1.7 or 1.8 to maximize lateral stability. No residential tower in the history of mainland construction had ever been permitted to rise this thin dot map animation, highlighting the high-end residential strip. Glowing red nodes appearing one after another, Huaxin's experimental needle was not an isolated anomaly. Within that same brief real estate window, a cluster of similarly extreme pencil towers was being aggressively plotted across China's Tier 1 financial hubs. In Shanghai, rival developers were drawing up plans for ultra-slim waterfront towers along the Huangpu River, pushing footprints down to 20 meters wide while shooting past 400 meters in height. This hyper-dense luxury phenomenon quickly earned a name across regional real estate desks: the Billionaire's Corridor. Municipal construction commissions and international real estate commentators celebrated these towers as definitive structural proof of the nation's unstoppable urban dominance. They weren't treated as mere apartment complexes. They were hailed as crucial civic infrastructure, unmistakable monuments, proving that domestic markets could attract the most daring engineering minds and monumental capital reserves on Earth. The local housing bureaus and planning departments issued aid to approvals with virtually zero structural pushback. Why? Because the existing municipal building codes contain no specialized regulatory mechanism designed to evaluate whether a residential building of this extreme slenderness was actually compatible with long-term human habitation. Nobody in a position of regulatory authority asked the critical question: what happens when people try to live at the top of a concrete needle? Dramatic music. Deep, bass-heavy hit. Visuals shift to glitzy opening day footage, champagne pouring, elite buyers in tailored suits. When the tower finally held its ribbon-cutting ceremony, it debuted as the single tallest residential structure in the entire region. The financial barrier to entry was staggering. Individual units started at a baseline of $7 million, while the multi-level penthouses situated near the crown commanded astronomical asking prices eclipsing $88 million. Glossy marketing brochures and press releases, distributed by Huoxin Real Estate, described the skyscraper as an absolute engineering beer. Eke through. A flawless structural machine that had permanently conquered the fundamental aerodynamic challenges of extreme altitude. Architecture journals ran multi-page analytical features on the tower's innovative load-bearing frame. In total, 96 ultra-luxury units were sold across the upper third of the tower, yielding an average transaction price of roughly $14.5 million per residence. These weren't speculative paper flips. They were premium acquisitions by ultra-high net worth individuals who believed they were buying into an unshakable structural masterpiece. Every single buyer who signed a contract had been guaranteed the exact same promise. The high-altitude sway had been fully accounted for. The advanced structural dampening systems had been subjected to rigorous peer reviews, and the tower was perfectly anchored. The total asset sellout value of the tower hovered near a jaw-dropping $1.4 billion, standing completely isolated on the skyline, visible from over 50 kilometers away on a clear afternoon. It symbolized the ultimate peak of elite high-rise living. But that $1.4 billion promise was about to violently fracture against the laws of physics. Sound effect, low-frequency metallic groan, water dripping rapidly, fast forward to the turn of the decade, and the Elite Homeowners Council officially filed a massive, multi-million-dollar structural defect lawsuit against Huoxin Real Estate Group and its construction affiliates. The documented structural, mechanical, and architectural defects listed in the formal complaint exceeded 1,500 distinct points of failure. The early warning signs hadn't taken long to surface. Within the first 24 months of occupancy, residents on the upper floors began reporting terrifying auditory anomalies. These weren't the standard, minor settling clicks or thermal expansion pops of a typical new concrete building adapting to its footprint. This was a deep, sustained structural groaning, an ominous, metallic screeching and concrete cracking sound that escalated in direct proportion to the external wind speeds. At a staggering 420 meters above the street, high-velocity wind isn't a temporary weather event. It is a permanent environmental reality. On any given day, the residents of this luxury needle are living at a cruising altitude where atmospheric weather is typically experienced only by commercial aircraft pilots. And then, the structural movement began triggering catastrophic mechanical failures. It started with the water lines, visuals, raw smartphone footage of water cascading down concrete elevator shafts, high-end light fixtures dripping water onto premium wood flooring. The building's highly pressurized mechanical systems began reporting sudden, violent water intrusion across multiple high-altitude zones. Major high-pressure water mains burst inside the service walls. Cascading water flooded directly into the main high-speed elevator shafts, frying the electronic guide rails and control modules. In one terrifying, documented incident, a dual-zone flooding event completely knocked out the tower's entire vertical transportation infrastructure, leaving multi-millionaire residents stranded at the top of a 100-story tower with no elevator access for days. High-pressure pipes in the deep subterranean levels ruptured under strange stress loads. Critical electrical distribution systems suffered massive short circuits. What had been heavily marketed as a precision-engineered, ultra-luxury residential machine was rapidly devolving into an unlivable, waterlogged vertical hazard. To understand the core engineering flaw behind this $1.4 billion catastrophe, we have to look at what high-velocity wind physically does to a concrete structure this terrifyingly thin. Graphic. Part 2. The physics of the extremimation. A detailed 3D structural model of the 425-meter tower subjected to high-velocity wind vectors. Red arrows wrap around the sharp square edges, creating rotating blue low-pressure vortex eddies spinning off the opposite sides. Narrator. To fully comprehend how a $1.4 billion architectural masterpiece transforms into a terrifying, groaning liability, you have to look past the premium marble and examine the raw, brutal physics of fluid dynamics. When high-velocity wind streams strike a skyscraper of standard proportions, the air mass is deflected, flowing smoothly around the wide structural bulk. But when you compress that structure's footprint down to a hyperslender 28 meters, while rocketing it 425 meters into the sky, the wind behaves entirely differently at extreme altitudes. Atmospheric currents don't just blow past the structure, grab it. As high-speed air hits the sharp, unyielding corners of the tower's square profile, the airflow abruptly detaches from the glass curtain wall. Instead of passing cleanly, it curls backward, generating a chaotic, alternating sequence of rapidly spinning, low-pressure, low-velocity eddies on the leeward sides of the building. Engineers define this destructive aerodynamic phenomenon as von Karman vortex shedding. In plain terms, the wind acts like an invisible, high-powered kinetic piston. It grips one side of the luxury tower, pulls it laterally, releases it, and then instantly hooks the opposing side, repeating the cycle with terrifying regularity. The frequency of this alternating pull is dictated entirely by the velocity of the storm and the geometric profile of the concrete column. And this is where the engineering crossed into the danger zone. If the frequency of those shedding vortices happens to align perfectly with the tower's inherent natural frequency, the entire skyscraper enters a state of violent structural resonance. Each subsequent gust of wind amplifies the next, causing the building to sway back and forth in an ever-expanding arc. Graphic. Mass vs. slenderness in a traditional, wide-body luxury development, like the massive residential blocks flanking Shanghai's Pudong district or Guangzhou's Pearl River Delta. The sheer weight of thousands of tons of standard concrete passively absorbs and dampens these lateral aerodynamic forces. But the Huaxin needle possessed neither the structural width nor the dead weight mass required to combat resonance passively. Rising at that unprecedented 1v15 slenderness ratio, it was fundamentally more vulnerable to vortex-induced oscillation than almost any other inhabited high-rise on the mainland. Blueprint zooming into the engineering blueprints, focusing on specific cross-sections labeled mechanical zone, louvered buffer area. Zhang Wei's designated engineering team and structural consultants from the China Academy of Building Research had identified this precise aerodynamic vulnerability long before the foundation was poured. They knew that if left unchecked, the top-floor penthouses would experience severe lateral displacement, rendering the ultra-luxury spaces completely unlivable due to chronic motion sickness. Their engineered solution was integrated directly into the tower's signature silhouette. Every 12 floors, the developer constructed a double-height mechanical and service level completely devoid of luxury apartments. Instead of being enclosed by a premium glass curtain wall, these specialized structural buffers were left entirely open to the elements, fitted only with heavy, industrial-grade steel louvered vents facing the exterior horizon. The underlying calculation was elegant on paper. These intentional open-air voids were designed to act as physical aerodynamic disruptors. As high-altitude winds rushed up the face of the skyscraper, the open mechanical floors would swallow the air mass, allowing it to pass cleanly through the core of the structure rather than wrapping violently around the corners. By physically breaking up the pressure differentials across the vertical span, the louvers would theoretically prevent the von Karman vortices from organizing into a synchronized, destructive rhythmic force. They were teaching the wind how to pass through the building without gripping it. Graphic. The reality gap. From mortal to metropolis during the initial design phase, this low-resistance louver system performed exactly to specification within advanced wind tunnel testing labs. Computer simulations verified the math, Top-tier structural engineers signed off on the blueprints, and the Municipal Housing and Construction Commission approved the high-rise permits. Ground was officially broken in 2012, unleashing a massive, continuous pouring operation utilizing hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of specialized high-performance concrete to form the hyper-dense central core. But by 2017, just 2 years after the elite residents moved their high-end furnishings into the clouds, the massive gap between the idealized lab models and the harsh reality of a living, breathing megastructure became impossible to ignore. Text on screen. Metric recurrings 12,800 lateral displace during heavy seasonal typhoons and high-velocity winter gales off the coast. The engineered louver systems failed to stop the lateral movement. Internal structural sensors buried deep within the core began logging massive physical displacements at the crown, with the upper floors shifting up to several feet off-center during peak wind events. While the tower's heavy concrete core was structura, strong enough to deform without collapsing, the physical movement inside the luxury apartments was deeply disturbing. High-end porcelain floor tiles began buckling under the intense compressive stress. Premium drywall finishes near the elevator shafts cracked open in jagged, millimeter-wide fissures as the building flexed. The acoustic impact was even worse. The high-velocity air rushing through the open mechanical louvers at 400 meters created a permanent, low-frequency acoustic whistle that vibrated through the building's structural columns, echoing inside the luxury residences like a continuous, haunting foghorn. The maintenance tickets were no longer tracking routine alignment or standard settlement. They were registering an escalating systemic engineering crisis. Graphic. The triangle of blame. When the Homeowners Council launched its massive structural defect lawsuit in 2021, the three primary institutional powers responsible for the tower's creation immediately dug in, hardening their legal positions into a classic triangle of corporate blame. The developer, Huaxin Real Estate Group, Zhang Wei's legal teams firmly maintained that the landmark tower had been constructed in absolute accordance with every engineering specification provided. Every single phase of the concrete pour and structural assembly had been monitored, reviewed, and endorsed by elite third-party engineering consultants, and ultimately granted official certificates of occupancy by the Municipal Construction Bureau. In the developer's official corporate statements, the 15,500 documented defects were downplayed as standard. High-altitude maintenance issues and cosmetic finish settlements that naturally occur when an incredibly complex megastructure reaches the expiration of its initial structural warranty period. The tower, they insisted, was safe. The architecture firm, the design team backed the developer's stance completely. They produced mountains of data, proving their architectural plans had undergone exhaustive peer reviews, rigorous wind tunnel validation, and meticulous compliance checks against all applicable national building standards before the first shovel touched the dirt. The structural sway documented by the wealthy residents, the architects argued, fell completely within the legal design parameters the skyscraper was engineered to tolerate. The building was doing exactly what it was designed to do. The Municipal Regulatory Bureau, the local housing and construction authorities stood behind their issued permits. They verified that the structure met every written safety code, had passed every fire safety evaluation, and possessed the structural integrity to withstand extreme seismic events and peak regional wind loads without catastrophic structural collapse. And this is where the true horror of the $1.4 billion luxury crisis reveals itself. The accountability mechanism completely dissolves because of a critical, hidden vulnerability in the regional regulatory framework. The national building codes enforce rigorous, non-negotiable thresholds for structural survival, meaning they regulate whether a skyscraper will stay standing during a disaster. What they do not contain are enforceable, legally binding thresholds for residential wind comfort. The law dictates whether an architectural marvel is structurally safe to be inside. It completely ignores whether the physical sensation of movement inside that high-altitude space is actually compatible with human psychological survival. The Huaxin Tower could simultaneously pass every single municipal engineering safety inspection with flying colors, while remaining an absolute, unlivable nightmare for the people trapped inside it during a heavy storm. No entity in the entire design, financing, or regulatory approval chain had any legal obligation to ask if the building's movement would make an owner seasick in their own living room. The developer demanded maximum height on a minimum footprint to maximize profit margins. The architects engineered the absolute thinnest concrete column possible to fulfill that vision. And the city rubber stamped it because it met the safety minimums. It was a perfect storm of regulatory oversight, and by the time the structural consequences became public record, several more ultra-slender luxury needles were already rising along the very same block. Graphic. Part 3. The Pensional Tower Contagion. A digital map of mainland China's eastern seaboard. Crimson warning beacons light up one after another over Shenzhen's Fujian district, Shanghai's Lujiazui, Guangzhou's Zhujiang New Town, and Tianjin's Binhai New Area. Narrator. To understand why the crisis at the Huaxin Needle is sending shockwaves through the entire architectural community, you have to realize that this isn't an isolated structural failure. What we are witnessing is the unfolding of a systemic design contagion that is quietly spread across China's most hyper-developed Tier 1 metropolises. The structural gap in building regulations didn't just affect one building in Shenzhen. It created a blueprint for an entire generation of unlivable glass needles. For the last 2 decades, China's vertical real estate market was driven by a single, insatiable directive: build higher, build thinner, and maximize the premium yield of every square meter of urban soil. Graphic. The engineering comparison. When we look at the evolution of the Chinese supertall, early structural masterpieces like the 492-meter Shanghai World Financial Center or the 632-meter Shanghai Tower relied on massive, wide-body engineering profiles. They utilized sweeping, aerodynamic tapers, rounded corners, and immense internal outrigger trusses that actively blunted the force of high-altitude Pacific typhoons. Their structural mass and wide bases acted as a giant anchor against lateral wind loads. But as prime urban land plots shrank and acquisition costs skyrocketed in financial hubs like Chongqing's Jifangbei or Guangzhou's Tianhe district, developers could no longer build wide. They began forcing architects to squeeze premium residential towers into narrow gaps between existing subway lines and commercial developments. The result? The rapid rise of the Chinese Pencil Tower. Megastructure profile height base width slenderness, ratio primary stabilization traditional super tall, e.g. Shanghai Tower 632-59
Variable 110.7 aerodynamic taper mega columns a luxury needle, Huaxin prototype
4528 115 open mechanical voids. Louvre's Ultra Slim Tier 1
proposed.
Built 440-24 118.3. High strength, concrete core only as the table demo. End straits. As you transition from commercial megastructures to ultra-slim luxury residential blocks, the slenderness ratio becomes dangerously compressed. When you push past the 112 threshold into the 115 and 118 zones, the fundamental physics of how a building handles kinetic energy undergoes a radical change. Visuals. B-roll of dense, foggy skylines in Chongqing. Cutting to macro footage of concrete testing labs where cylinders are crushed under immense hydraulic pressure. This structural shift collided head-on with another unique reality of mainland construction: the hyper-accelerated building cycle. In the race to deliver luxury units to the market before financing rates shifted, these pencil towers were subjected to aggressive construction schedules. High-performance concrete formulas, engineered to cure rapidly, were pumped hundreds of meters into the sky at a blistering pace of one floor every 3 to 4 days. While this rapid cycle successfully met development deadlines, it introduced a critical, long-term engineering variable that is now returning to haunt these projects: micro-settlement and differential structural deflection. When a building is that thin, even a minute variation in the pouring consistency of the concrete core, or a fraction of a millimeter of unexpected shifting in the deep foundation piles, driven into the soft alluvial soil of river deltas like Shanghai or Guangzhou, amplifies catastrophically as you approach the crown. A microscopic tilt at the subterranean base translates into a permanent, multi-inch structural lean at 400 meters. Graphic: the ghost of failing architecture when the structural defects of the Huaxin Needle became a matter of public record. Engineers across the country instantly drew parallels to other high-profile high-rise panics that have gripped mainland municipal bureaus. Everyone in the industry remembers the terrifying scenes that unfolded at the 355-meter Seg Plaza in Shenzhen, when the entire super-tall building suddenly began violently shaking and oscillating on a clear, windless afternoon. Thousands of pedestrians fled in panic as the tower wobbled, forcing an immediate, months-long occupancy ban while emergency engineering teams scrambled to determine the cause. The structural diagnosis for that disaster: a fatal combination of rooftop architectural masts catching high-altitude winds and generating destructive resonance, coupled with subtle microcracking inside the primary steel-reinforced concrete core. Archival footage. Drone footage circling unfinished, skeletal concrete high-rise towers standing abandoned in the mist outside major urban centers. The structural panic at the Huaxin Needle represents a completely different and arguably more insidious category of failure. The Seg Plaza was a commercial office tower that suffered from unexpected resonant frequencies that could eventually be remediated by stripping away architectural elements. The luxury pencil towers of the billionaire's corridor cannot be easily fixed. Their vulnerability isn't an added-on decorative mast. It is baked directly into the fundamental geometry of their primary load-bearing walls. Municipal construction commissions across China are now quietly reviewing the permits of dozens of ultra-residential high-rises currently under construction are awaiting final occupancy certificates in Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities. Engineering panels from the China Academy of Building Research are being discreetly dispatched to install advanced, high-precision laser telemetry sensors inside the elevator shafts of multiple luxury towers. The goal of these emergency deployments is clear. They are rushing to map out exactly how many of these luxury needles are actively bending, groaning, and whipping out of control behind their shimmering faux glass curtain walls. The terrifying reality facing regulators is that the real estate market has outpaced the legal framework of civil engineering. For years, city planners treated these pencil towers as prestigious vanity projects, dazzling spectacles of engineering prowess that signaled a city's arrival onto the global economic stage. But behind the spectacular marketing displays lay a cold, unyielding physical truth that no amount of real estate capital could alter. You cannot build a 115 concrete needle without exposing its internal infrastructure to immense, destructive, and continuous physical stress. And while the developers, architects, and municipal bureaus continue to trade legal briefs and evade liability, the wealthy buyers trapped at the top of these shaking towers are learning exactly what happens when luxury real estate logic completely detaches from the laws of physics. Graphic. Part 4. The human cost in the clout's visuals. The screen fades up on dark, moody night footage of a sweeping megacity skyline. The camera slowly tracks up the razor-thin profile of the Huaxin Tower as storm clouds whip past its glowing crown. Deep, ominous percussion sets an anxious, tense mood. Narrator: when a $1.4 billion structural masterpiece begins to fail, it doesn't just disrupt real estate spreadsheets or municipal engineering archives. It shatters the daily lives of the human beings trapped inside it. To fully comprehend the sheer psychological terror of inhabiting a concrete needle that is actively whipping through the atmosphere, you have to look past the corporate denials and listen to the first-hand accounts of those who signed their names to these multi-million-dollar titles. Graphic. Case study. The 88th-floor penthouse. Consider the harrowing experience of Mr. Li Jun, a highly successful tech entrepreneur from Shenzhen. In 2016, seeking the ultimate symbol of his professional achievement, Li invested an astronomical 120 million Chinese yuan, roughly 17.5 million yuan, to acquire a spectacular, full-floor penthouse near the top of the tower. He was promised an unassailable sanctuary in the clouds, featuring panoramic 360-degree views of the glittering bay and a living space engineered to the highest standards of international luxury. Instead, Lee bought a front row seat to an ongoing structural nightmare. Text on screen, witness testimony, Mr. Li Jun, 88th floor resident, during his very first winter occupancy, as a massive seasonal cold front swept across the South China Sea, Lee realized that the engineering promises he had relied upon were completely hollow. Sitting in his ultra-premium living room on a night when external wind gusts breached 90 kilometers per hour, Lee watched in absolute disbelief as the water inside his custom-built infinity aquarium began sloshing violently from side to side within an hour. The physical movement of the penthouse became so pronounced that he and his family began experiencing the distinct, nauseating sensations of severe motion sickness. But it wasn't just the physical sway that weaponized the space against its inhabitants. It was the terrifying, inescapable acoustic environment. As the high-velocity, high-altitude winds struck the building's sharp corners and rushed through the open-air mechanical vents just floors below him, the entire apartment began to vibrate. Lee described the sound as a deep structural groan, a continuous, low-frequency metallic screeching that echoed directly out of the high-strength concrete core walls. Every time a major wind vector slammed into the building, the walls emitted a loud, sharp cracking sound, like a massive tree trunk snapping under pressure. As the interior drywall and high-end marble finishes flexed violently to accommodate the building's lateral deformation. Graphic, the mechanical invasion, emation, a 3D schematic highlighting the open-air mechanical floor. Red, freezing external air and heavy driving rain are shown, blasting through the steel louvers, directly contacting high-pressure water mains, electrical conduits, and elevator guide rails. The physical swaying was bad enough, but the ultimate failure of the tower lay in the cascading destruction of its internal utility systems. A direct consequence of the very engineering solution meant to save it, to keep the building from oscillating to a catastrophic degree. The architects had left the double-height mechanical floors entirely open to the external elements. But this meant that the lifeblood of the building, the highly pressurized domestic water pipes, the massive HVAC coolant loops, and the electrical infrastructure, was left completely exposed to extreme high-altitude weather conditions, temperature swings, and driving tropical downpours across years of continuous operation. In the late winter of 2019, a sudden, historic drop in temperature sent freezing winds blasting directly through the open steel louvers of the 72nd floor. Because the internal utility lines passing through these open voids were not designed to sustain direct, prolonged exposure to freezing atmospheric currents without substantial insulation. A critical high-pressure water main fractured. Visuals. Dramatic, authentic smartphone footage taken by building maintenance staff. Torrents of high-pressure water blasting out of a ruptured 8-inch steel pipe, cascading down concrete stairwells and turning a luxury elevator lobby into an interior waterfall. The results were instantaneous and catastrophic. Millions of liters of highly pressurized water erupted from the ruptured main, completely inundating the 72nd floor service deck before finding the path of least resistance. The primary high-speed elevator shafts, water cascaded down the vertical transport shafts like a roaring mountain river. The liquid deluged the sensitive electronic guide systems, short-circuited the high-voltage traction motors, and completely fried the computerized control modules of the tower's elite vertical lift system. The building's emergency safety mechanisms instantly locked down the entire elevator grid, leaving dozens of ultra-wealthy residents, including elderly family members and young children, completely stranded at altitudes exceeding 300 meters. For 3 agonizing days, vertical access to the upper thirds of the tower was entirely severed. Residents who had paid tens of millions of dollars for an elite living experience were forced to choose between conquering nearly 1,000 steps of a damp, concrete emergency stairwell or remaining completely trapped in their apartments, relying on building staff to manually haul emergency food and bottled water up 80 flights of stairs. Graphic. The spreading. The flooding of 2019 was not a freak, one-off incident. According to the comprehensive defect inventory, later compiled by the Homeowners Council legal team, the tower suffered at least 4 major, high-altitude water intrusion events over a 3-year span, subterranean stress failures. The immense physical forces generated by the upper tower's continuous swaying began translating all the way down into the subterranean basement parking structures and foundation caps. The heavy structural joints where the vertical concrete core met the horizontal foundation piles began displaying deep, weeping structural cracks, requiring continuous emergency injection of chemical waterproofing resins to prevent groundwater from flooding the electrical switch rooms. Curtain wall delamination. At the 300-meter mark, the intense lateral shearing forces caused by the building's permanent structural lean began warping the aluminum tracks of the premium glass curtain walls. Residents began reporting that windows could no longer be completely sealed, allowing high-altitude wind to hiss continuously through millimeter-wide gaps, bringing moisture and soot directly into multi-million-dollar bedrooms. Elevator cable sway. Because the high-speed elevator cables spanned hundreds of vertical meters inside a narrow, swaying concrete shaft, the cables themselves began oscillating in resonance with the wind. During major storms, the swinging steel cables would violently strike the interior walls of the concrete shafts, creating a deafening, rhythmic hammering sound that reverberated through every apartment adjacent to the building core. Visuals. A dramatic montage of high-end luxury interiors juxtaposed with crude construction tools. Images of premium chevron wood flooring warped and buckled by water damage. Large sheets of plastic tarp hanging over imported Italian marble walls. And industrial dehumidifiers humming loudly inside an abandoned elite penthouse. The financial and physical toll on the owners was mounting exponentially. Another resident, Ms. Chen Min, who occupied a luxury unit on the 65th floor, recounted the heartbreaking destruction of her home following a separate pipe failure on a mechanical level above her. "I returned from a business trip to find my entire apartment destroyed," Chen stated in her official legal deposition. The water had seeped through the concrete ceiling slabs, completely destroying my collection of rare ink paintings, warping over 200 square meters of custom imported hardwood flooring, and causing the premium plaster ceilings to collapse entirely into the living space. The damage exceeded 8 million yuan, but the developer told us it was simply a routine adjustment issue. The psychological strain on the community was palpable. The tower had transformed from a prestigious, hyper-exclusive vertical neighborhood into an elite war zone of litigation, endless maintenance noise, and constant anxiety. Every time a dark storm front gathered on the horizon, residents didn't look out at the beautiful view with pride. They looked at the sky with genuine dread, knowing that within hours, their homes would begin to shift. Their walls would begin to groan, and their lives would once again be subjected to the terrifying physics of the luxury needle. Graphic. Part 5. The Fixed Fault and the Devoured Sky Visuals. The screen transitions to a stark, high-altitude drone shot hovering directly over the crown of the razor-thin concrete needle. Below, the urban sprawl of the financial district spreads out in a dense grid, completely dwarfed by the sheer elevation. The background music shifts to a somber, analytical ambient tone. Narrator. Following the bombshell filing of the multi-million-dollar lawsuit by the Elite Homeowners Council, Huaxin Real Estate Group and its construction partners were forced to initiate a massive, hyper-targeted structural remediation program. Teams of specialized industrial contractors descended upon the tower, transforming the most expensive residential address in the district into an active, high-altitude repair zone. Engineers and construction crews worked around the clock to repair or replace hundreds of meters of failed high-pressure plumbing lines. The high-speed elevator shafts, heavily compromised by structural water intrusion, were stripped down, their electronic guide rail systems realigned, and advanced moisture-resistant control modules installed. Across dozens of ultra-luxury apartments, technical teams meticulously unmounted shattered wall panels to reinstall heavy-duty, industrial ceiling gaskets around the warping tracks of the premium glass curtain walls. Graphic. The unremediable condition. The total financial capital poured into this sweeping remediation effort remains tightly guarded behind non-disclosure agreements. But industry insiders estimate the cost has comfortably breached tens of millions of dollars. The physical repairs successfully targeted the immediate symptoms of the failure. They patched the broken pipes, dried out the elevator pits, and replaced the ruined finishes. But they failed to alter the single variable that matters most. The fundamental condition that generated this structural disaster can never be remediated. The extreme 1:15 slenderness ratio of the tower is permanently fixed in the millions of tons of high-strength concrete poured into the sky between 2012 and 2015. Animation. A 3D architectural cross-section of a standard super-tall skyscraper showing a massive multi-ton steel sphere suspended by heavy cables at its crown, labeled Tuned Mass Damper, TMD. The animation cuts back to the narrow Huasan Tower blueprint, showing a complete lack of physical space inside the upper core to house such a system in standard commercial super-talls, like the iconic Taipei 101 or the massive CITIC Tower in Beijing. Structural engineers actively mitigate wind-induced oscillation by installing a tuned mass damper. These are monumental, multi-hundred-ton steel pendulums suspended near the very top of the building, computer-controlled to swing in direct opposition to the wind's movement, dynamically absorbing the skyscraper's kinetic energy. But a tuned mass damper requires immense internal structural volume. It demands multiple floors of open, wide-body space at the crown, a luxury that simply does not exist inside a residential needle built on a narrow 28-meter footprint. Retrofitting a massive steel pendulum system into a fully occupied, hyper-slender residential core at over 400 meters of elevation is a physical and practical engineering impossibility. The structural bones of the tower are unalterable. The building is, and will forever be, exactly what it was designed to be. The catastrophic irony is that what it was designed to be turns out to be entirely different from the unshakable high-altitude sanctuary that was sold to the market. Graphic. The market reality this engineering failure has triggered a direct, brutal correction across the regional luxury real estate market. Units inside the Huaxin Needle that were aggressively fought over at peak prices during the mid-2010s boom are now appearing on secondary brokerage desks at staggering, unprecedented discounts. The multi-million-dollar defect lawsuit is a permanent matter of public record. Any sophisticated high-net-worth buyer conducting standard asset due diligence instantly uncovers the tower's long history of structural swaying, acoustic vibration, and mechanical flooding. The prestigious reputational aura that once allowed the developer to command astronomical premiums has evaporated. The brand damage to the luxury needle cannot be patched over by a remediation program any more than its geometric slenderness can be altered. Whenever heavy seasonal typhoons barrel across the coastline, the building moves. The internal digital telemetry sensors buried deep inside the core continuously log the physical displacement, tracking every inch of lateral drift at the crown, permanently etching the building's erratic movement into its structural record. That physical reality is fixed visuals. A final, slow, dramatic zoom out from a single glowing window at the very top of the dark glass column. The city below fades into a blur of neon lights as the camera retreats into the night sky, which brings our investigation back to those open-air mechanical floors. The louvered voids that cut directly through the tower's ultra-slim silhouette every 12 stories were, by every established principle of wind tunnel engineering, the absolute correct response to a correctly identified aerodynamic threat. They successfully disrupted the von Karman vortex, shedding exactly as the computational models predicted. They reduced the building's lateral oscillation from what would have been a catastrophic structural failure down to a safe, flexible tolerance. The structural engineers fulfilled their brief. The building stays standing, but the devastating consequence is this. The engineering solution that saved the tower from structural collapse is the exact mechanism that triggered its operational demise. By leaving those critical floors entirely open to the elements to pacify the wind, they exposed the building's most vulnerable utility infrastructure to continuous environmental degradation. The fix was the failure. The ultra-wealthy residents who poured their fortunes into the most celebrated residential monument in recent history are now left navigating an endless maze of complex legal proceedings, disruptive remediation schedules, and a secondary resale market that has permanently revised its assessment of what a glass needle in the sky is actually worth. And that market revision has offered zero comfort to the buyers. The Huashan Tower still stands completely isolated against the horizon. It remains a marvel of human ambition, one of the tallest residential structures ever attempted on the mainland. But inside the upper-floor penthouses of that $1.4 billion concrete needle, whenever the high-altitude winds begin to gather, a resident who spent more on their apartment than most families will earn, across multiple generations, is left sitting in the dark, watching the water sway in their glass, and listening to the groaning of the walls. If the hidden engineering decisions and financial cover-ups behind the world's most expensive architectural disaster are worth understanding, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There are more investigations on the way, and the physics do not get any simpler. Channel out.